When Requeswint died naturally in 672, he was succeeded by Wamba, a man of some prominence from another noble Gothic family. According to Julian of Toledo's Historiae Wambae Regis, despite his advanced age, Wamba had the support of the clergy, the common folk, and the Gothic nobility. An English translation of Julian's account illustrates the point. Quote, "Now he claims that he will not take office with so many disasters impending, and now he argues that he is worn out by age. He is resisting fiercely when one of the commanders, as if about to act for everyone else, stands in the middle of the crowd and, fixing him with a threatening expression, says, 'Know that unless you consent to our wishes, you will be cut down by the blade of my sword. Indeed, we will not leave before either our nation has received you as king, or else, refusing, you have been swallowed by a bloody death today.'" Unquote. While this does seem downright bizarre, it is this very fact that makes me believe it. Having a Gothic noble threaten to kill Wamba would hardly be the first scene most historians would conjure up if they had revisionism in mind. Interestingly, as it turns out, the author, Julian of Toledo, was himself of a Jewish background. His parents had converted to Catholicism, probably during the time of Quintilla, and raised him to be very anti-Jewish. Roger Collins refers to Julian as, quote, "the most fervent or fanatical of all the churchmen of the Visigothic period in his anti-Jewish writings and activities," unquote. The Chronicle of 754 refers to Julian as descended from Jewish stock, and that he, quote, "like a rose blossom amidst the thorns, shone throughout the world for his understanding of Christian doctrine," unquote. To cite Bernard Bachrach's work again, quote, "Julian, the Archbishop of Toledo, maintained that the Jews in Gaul were not persecuted, and lamented that Gaul was a brothel of blaspheming Jews. In the revolt against Wamba, the only such episode about which we are relatively well informed, the Jews played an important political and military role. Duke Paul chose the city for his coronation and capital. This time, however, the Jews did not support the royal faction. Wamba had been the legitimate successor of Requeswint, and the Jews probably expected him to carry on his predecessor's anti-Jewish policy when they followed their apparent self-interest and opposed him. The military action taken by the Jews of Narbonne reinforces the impression that La Force de l'Argent was not the only power wielded by the Jewish faction in Visigothic politics. Wamba, however, was not a religious fanatic, and his appreciation of the power of the Jewish community apparently led him to a rapprochement with them. The Jews of Narbonne were allowed to return to their city, where for a long time afterward, they continued to be a dominant force. Wamba, in addition, did not enforce the existing anti-Jewish laws, and at the councils that met during his reign, the Jewish question was not discussed," unquote. Coincidentally, the same Jewish communities within the same region had supported the Frankish conquest against the Visigoths in the early 6th century as well. Bachrach informs us again. Quote, "In 508, when the Merovingians laid siege to Arles, the Jews who garrisoned a part of the city planned to hand over the defenses to Clovis's forces. That the Jews of Arles should prefer the dominance of the Orthodox Clovis to the dominance of the Arian Visigoths suggests that the Frankish ruler had not gained an anti-Jewish reputation during the preceding decade of conquest. In fact, the preference of the Jews of Arles for Clovis may suggest that he had been overtly pro-Jewish," unquote. The revolt against Wamba in 672, curiously, involved the Franks and the Jews yet again, but Wamba is recorded to have crushed the revolt. However, just as his predecessor Requeswint had done before him, Wamba treated the vanquished with remarkable mercy and restraint. The spirit of rebellion had broken out within the besieged city of Nimes, where Paul and the other conspirators were making their final stand. Julian of Toledo tells us that distrust ran rampant and everyone began killing each other to the dismay of Paul. A bishop rode out to meet Wamba and begged him to show mercy upon the devastated city. Not only did Wamba show mercy, but before returning to Toledo, he had the dead buried and the city's defenses rebuilt. Paul and the other Gothic leaders of the rebellion were decalvated and exiled rather than killed. The Franks involved were simply sent home. The Jews of the city were initially banished, as Katz mentioned earlier, but Wamba eventually allowed them to return. Later in his reign, according to the Chronicle of Alfonso, 270 Arab ships attacked the coast of Hispania, but Wamba was successful in repelling them as well. Historians argue, however, that a single attack of this size is doubtful, since no other source mentions it. At the time, indeed, the Arabs were already rolling over most of North Africa, but this would have still been far too early for them to be attacking Spain directly. While the Chronicle of 754 does say that the Moors had long been raiding southern Spain and simultaneously devastating many cities, Kenneth Baxter Wolfe, its most recent translator, claims that this is in reference to the year before the defeat of King Roderick by the Moors, over 3 decades after Wamba's reign. Although there is a debate as to the exact nature of it, most scholars and historians agree that Wamba was deposed via a court conspiracy. Count Urwig was the probable perpetrator, and Julian of Toledo may have supported him. The 12th Council in 681 records that Wamba fell ill and supposedly undertook the state of penitence, since it was thought that he would die. Taking penitence during this period could only be done once in a person's life, and according to legal precedent, doing so disqualified a monarch from remaining on the throne. Thompson informs us on what happened in more detail. Quote, accordingly, in a document which Wamba was able to sign with his own hand, he nominated the Count Urwig as his successor, an action that was sharply contrary to the canons of the Church. This document, which the bishops at the 12th Council one by one examined with close attention, was witnessed by the señores who were present when he signed it. He also composed another document, and this too was produced for the inspection by the bishops at the 12th Council. It was addressed to Julian of Toledo, who had now been metropolitan for more than 8 months, and directed him to anoint Urwig as soon as possible. There is evidence that Wamba protested strongly that he was not barred from reascending the throne, but his opposition was overruled. The truth is that canon law, if strictly applied, prohibited him from resuming the throne, and it is no coincidence that in 642 Kindiswint had tonsured Tolga when he deposed him. But if the nobility and the bishops had wanted Wamba to continue his reign, the law could easily have been waived. The events were strange, and Urwig undoubtedly expected that contemporaries would find them suspicious. In order to anticipate accusations, we may suppose he and the bishops thought it important to set out as solemnly as possible their version of what had happened, and in the tome which he handed to the 12th Council, Urwig urged the bishops to publish the facts." Unquote. The Chronicle of Alfonso, written over 200 years later, claims that Wamba had been poisoned by Urwig. Roger Collins, however, points out that the Chronicle of 754 makes no mention of this, and, in fact, it passes over the succession of Urwig to Wamba without comment. Moreover, Collins asserts that Wamba must have been sufficiently sound in both mind and body to have signed the 2 documents that they recorded they had inspected and authenticated. For this reason, Collins calls the Chronicle of Alfonso's claim that Wamba was poisoned nonsensical. But curiously, what the Chronicle of Alfonso actually says is that Urwig gave Wamba, quote, an herb called Spartus to drink, and immediately Wamba's memory was taken away. When the bishop of the city and the nobles of the palace, who were faithful to the king, ignorant of the workings of the potion, saw the king prostrate and without his memory, they were moved out of piety to administer immediately the order of confession and penance, lest the king die outside the order of penance. When the king recovered from the potion and understood what had happened, he went straight to a monastery." Unquote. Charles Joseph Afella, in Volume 5 of his History of the Church Councils, says that, quote, Urwig, a very able man but extremely ambitious, made an effort to reach the throne, and brought to the old king, October 14th, 680, a bad drought to deprive him not of life but of reason. Unquote. Afella wrote this in the 19th century and was probably basing his opinion on the same sources as Collins, but I would argue that it's still a reasonable interpretation of the events. The bishops and the nobles would have needed to speak with Wamba in order to ascertain that he had lost his memory. Thus, the context suggests that Wamba was able to speak and communicate, at least to some extent. Perhaps his altered mental state allowed Julian and Urwig to coerce him into signing a series of documents, the extent of which Wamba had no real understanding. As far as the Palatines go, who were present when Wamba signed these documents, it seems unlikely that they would have suspected anything since Wamba was already an old man. They probably figured he was having a stroke. The second canon is almost comically entitled, quote, on those who receive penitence when they are without sense, unquote. It does not mention Wamba by name, but it does speak of the many people who are ungrateful for the penitence they receive while in a compromised mental state, and later recover. It states that if anyone, after being admitted to a state of penitence, seeks to violate this conciliar institution, they shall be punished as transgressors of the paternal principles. Curiously, it also says that any priest who thenceforth gave penitence with reckless audacity to a person without sense, or who did not request it, would be excommunicated for 1 year if he could not prove that the person had displayed either with their hands or by some other movement a gesture of willingness. Despite his concerns over the historicity of the Chronicle of Alfonso, even Collins agrees that there were a number of other irregularities surrounding this succession. He highlights that a detailed regnal list of the late 7th century, which its editor called the Chronica Regum Visigotorum, makes it clear that Wamba's receiving penance preceded the proclamation of Erwig as king by a matter of only a few hours. Moreover, legal precedent prohibited the king from choosing his successor. Wamba himself had been crowned king expressly by the consent of a council, and this was something Julian of Toledo had exalted in his writings. Yet Wamba's election of Erwig as his successor is the key element in Erwig's accession to the throne. It's also suspicious that Erwig later readmitted to royal favor many of the nobles who had rebelled against Wamba, and whom Wamba had not pardoned. Erwig restored their confiscated property and their right to give legal testimony. The Chronicle of Alfonso also says that Erwig's father was not even a Goth, but rather a Byzantine named Artabastus, who had fled to Hispania after being expelled from Greece. For what reason, the Chronicle doesn't say, though Kindeswint apparently, quote, received him magnificently and gave to him his niece in marriage, unquote. If this account is correct, then Erwig was closely related to Kindeswint and Reckeswint, although I don't see how this gives any additional explanatory power to the plot. There doesn't seem to be any evidence that the families of Wamba and Reckeswint were rivals prior to this incident. Julian of Toledo's motivations seem to be attributed to the concerns over the primacy of Toledo in religious matters. As Collins writes, quote, under Wamba, whose legitimacy Julian had so eloquently argued in his Historia, the position of the See of Toledo was weakened by the king's decision to create new dioceses. One of these was established in Lusitania, centered on the monastery of Aquis, the place of burial of an otherwise unknown martyr called Epimenius. The other new see, far more extraordinarily, was created in the Orbs Regia of Toledo itself, where the Praetorian Church of Saints Peter and Paul in the suburb of the city was placed in the hands of a new bishop. We know of these creations only from the acts of the 12th Council of Toledo of January 681, which abolished both of them. Wamba was here blamed by name for these foolish and unjust creations, and was accused of violence in forcing them through against strong objections. As this was the king whose removal from the throne had just been so closely scrutinized by the bishops, it is clear that some of them at least were mightily relieved to see the back of him, and moved at once to suppress what they regarded as his illicit acts, unquote. Once he was on the throne, Erwig not only reaffirmed the anti-Jewish laws enacted under Reckeswint, but he enacted an additional 28 new laws. These varied in nature, but many were expressly hostile to the Jewish culture itself. Laws 3, 4, and 5 forbade the celebration of Jewish holidays such as Passover, and didn't allow anyone to observe the Sabbath. Concerning circumcision, any Jewish man who performed it on a Christian, or even a Jew for that matter, was to be mutilated and his property confiscated. The exact words used to refer to the mutilation are veretri ex toto amputatione plectetur. Scott says that it will not bear translation, but certainly falls under cruel and unusual punishments. While I will not claim to know precisely what this punishment involved, it seems that the entire penis was amputated. The punishment for a woman who performed circumcisions was only slightly less harsh. Her nose was to be cut off and her property confiscated. While certainly cruel, the Jews had been mutilating Christian and pagan genitals for centuries at this point, despite being repeatedly asked to stop and despite having been granted legal exemptions to perform the procedure on their own men. I do not believe that the Jews had a divine right to remove the foreskin of non-Jewish males under their patronage, regardless of how anyone else felt about it. Law 6 declared that Jews were to rest on Sunday along with Christians. Interestingly, however, the law reveals that the Jews had been working their Christian slaves on Sundays, thereby denying them the observance of their own religious rights. Jewish law forbade slaves to work on the Sabbath, so it may have been expected for them to force Christians to work on Sunday, lest they suffer a loss in productivity. Law 7 stated that Jews could no longer discern between clean and unclean food, or rather, they could no longer abide by kosher dietary laws. It should be stressed here that Jewish distinctions in foods are not made based on whether or not food is healthy, but rather on whether or not it is prepared by a fellow Jew and meets certain related religious standards. Consider the practice of Tevilat Kelim, whereby utensils acquired from non-Jews need to go through a ritual of purification before they can be used by a Jew. Curiously, the practice probably arose in the Old Testament when the Israelites committed genocide against the Midianites. The book of Numbers tells us that the Jews, quote, fought against Midian, as the Lord commanded Moses, and killed every man. Among their victims were Evi, Rechem, Zur, Hur, and Reba, the 5 kings of Midian. They also killed Balaam, son of Beor, with the sword. The Israelites captured the Midianite women and children, and took all the Midianite herds, flocks, and goods as plunder. They burned all the towns where the Midianites had settled, as well as all their camps. They took all the plunder and spoils, including the people and animals, and brought the captives, spoils, and plunder to Moses and Eleazar, the priest in the Israelite assembly at their camp on the plains of Moab, by the Jordan across from Jericho. Moses, Eleazar the priest, and all the leaders of the community went to meet them outside the camp. Moses was angry with the officers of the army, the commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds, who returned from the battle. "Have you allowed all the women to live?" he asked them. "They were the ones who followed Balaam's advice and enticed the Israelites to be unfaithful to the Lord in the Peor incident, so that a plague struck the Lord's people. Now kill all the boys, and kill every woman who has slept with a man, but save for yourselves every girl who has never slept with a man. Anyone who has killed someone or touched someone who was killed must stay outside the camp 7 days. On the 3rd and 7th days you must purify yourselves and your captives. Purify every garment as well as everything made of leather, goat hair, or wood." Then Eleazar the priest said to the soldiers who had gone into battle, "This is what is required by the law that the Lord gave Moses. Gold, silver, bronze, iron, tin, lead, and anything else that can withstand fire must be put through the fire, and then it will be clean. But it must also be purified with the water of cleansing, and whatever cannot withstand fire must be put through that water. On the 7th day, wash your clothes and you will be clean. Then you may come into the camp." Unquote. Returning to Erwig's enactments at the 12th Council, Law 8 forbade Jews from engaging in incestuous marriages, as defined by marrying within the 6th degree of relation. In practice, this meant they couldn't marry their second cousins. Indeed, it is interesting that this should be seen as a form of persecution. Hollywood for years has made fun of white Americans as being largely inbred and incestuous, when in fact, Europeans the world over have the lowest levels of consanguineous marriages.
Don't me up just like the family learned in the War of Northern Aggression.
In any event, for as hostile as these laws were to the Jewish community, they often reveal Jewish hostility toward the Christian community. For example, Law 11 forbade the reading or distribution of books that denied the Christian faith. This is more than likely a reference to the Talmud, which, among other things, states that Jesus is boiling in hot excrement in hell for having ridiculed the words of the sages. The relevant passages are in Gittin 57a, but for a full breakdown of their context, read Peter Schaeffer's chapter on Jesus' punishment in hell from his book, Jesus in the Talmud. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to continue reading through the entire set of laws. Let us move on to what their aim was. Bernard Bachrach informs us that Erwig's policies were intended to, quote, deter his enemies from providing protection and support for the Jews. For example, individual bishops and abbots had employed, and were continuing to employ, Jews as agents to administer ecclesiastical estates. These abbots and bishops were warned to stop the practice. Bishops convicted of having sexual relations with Jewish women were to be defrocked and sent into exile. Ecclesiastical and secular officials who failed to enforce Erwig's anti-Jewish laws were liable for a fine of 72 solidi for each offense they ignored. Anyone who accepted a bribe for not reporting a Jew who broke these laws was also liable for a fine. As part of the de-Judification process, every Jew was required to sign a statement abjuring Judaism and adhering to Christianity. These statements were to be placed in the archives of the churches in the areas where the new converts dwelled. It should be noted that none of these sworn statements have survived, which may suggest a lack of widespread enforcement of Erwig's anti-Jewish policy. In addition, we know that as late as 694, Jews still owned Christian slaves and carried on business as usual, unquote. Earwig was succeeded eventually by another anti-Jewish king, Egeka, who ruled from 687 to 702. The Chronicle of Alfonso states that Earwig gave his daughter Kixilo in marriage to Egeka, who was, as it turns out, Wamba's nephew. Roger Collins suggests that Earwig may have married his daughter to Egeka with the intention of rectifying his past transgressions against Wamba. Egeka, Wamba's nephew, would be king, Kixilo, Earwig's daughter, queen, and thus Earwig's family would be protected and Wamba's family satisfied. If this was Earwig's intention, Collins tells us that, quote, "This was a fatal miscalculation, as once he had become king, Egeka clearly felt it more expedient to rid himself of the connection, plunder the resources of Earwig's family and their allies, and free himself to marry again," unquote. The Chronicle of Alfonso states that when Egeka gained the throne, quote, "His maternal uncle King Wamba ordered him to repudiate his wife Kixilo because her father Earwig had cunningly removed him from power. Egeka followed his orders and dismissed her on some pretext, but before her repudiation, she had given Egeka a son named Witiza, whom the king made his partner and ruled during his own lifetime. Egeka ordered Witiza to live in the city of Toi, so that, while the father held the kingship of the Goths, the son would rule the Suebi. Egeka ruled for 10 years before the accession of his son, and 5 more years with his son as co-ruler. He died a natural death in Toledo," unquote. Interestingly, another scholar, Alexander Pierre Broniche, points out that Egeka could have only divorced Kixilo if she were guilty of adultery. This would have carried great shame, and yet in the 7th canon of the 17th Council of Toledo, she is mentioned as the glorious Queen Kixilo. And the same canon expounds upon how she and her children must be safeguarded in the unfortunate event that Egeka dies prematurely. This was written 7 years after Earwig's death, and yet Egeka was still married to Kixilo, and she was still the queen. Eventually, a plot unfolded to kill Egeka and usurp the throne. It was led by Bishop Sigebert of Toledo, Julian's successor. In fact, this revolt was initially successful in crowning and anointing a new king, Sunifred, who reigned long enough to mint coins in his name. Roger Collins claims that the 9th canon of the 16th Council names Liuwigolto, Earwig's widow and Kixilo's mother, as one of Sigebert's co-conspirators. Yet Edward Thompson says the opposite, that Liuwigolto was one of Sigebert's targets. Perhaps the confusion arises from the use of the preposition cum to designate the relationship between Sigebert and the other persons in question, who are either rendered victims or co-conspirators based on how one interprets the word. The late Juan Tejada, who translated many of the councils from Latin into Spanish during the mid-1800s, translated the relevant line in such a way that Liuwigolto is clearly an intended target of Sigebert. That said, it is of note that Egeka summoned a provincial synod in 691, whereby Kixilo's mother was thereafter to live out her days in a monastery. Thompson says that Egeka did this, quote, because he wanted to ruin his wife's relatives, unquote. Interestingly, the canon does not mention Liuwigolto specifically, although I suppose it didn't need to. Widowed queens were to live out their days in a monastery, and she was a widowed queen. On the other hand, the text suggests a general desire to protect royal widows from plots and conspiracies. If Liuwigolto had indeed been an intended target of Sigebert's and Sunifred's rebellion, this would perhaps make sense. Again, Kixilo is mentioned 3 years later at the 17th Council as the Glorious Queen. Of course, it is the council's words, not Egeka's. Either way, Egeka was still married to her at the time. To further complicate things, Egeka had sworn an oath to Earwig that he would protect Earwig's children and his family as if they were his own. But at the 15th Council, Egeka asserts to the bishops that, since he was now king, this oath conflicted with the royal obligation to give justice to the people. Thompson writes that, quote, "The wrongs that Earwig had inflicted upon the people, Egeka declared, could not be righted without harm to Earwig's children. Perhaps he meant that Earwig had given to his children property that he had taken from those persons whom, according to Egeka, he had wrongfully condemned. This cannot be restored to its rightful owners without loss to Earwig's children. The new king, therefore, asked the bishops to release him from one or other of these contradictory oaths." He told them to put aside all fear and favor in coming to a decision, but the wording of his tome left them in no doubt as to which of the oaths he wished to discard. The bishops obliged him to the extent that they declared the public interest to be more important than the interests of a single family. But the oath in favor of Erwig's family must not be wholly disregarded. The king must love his people and his family equally. Justice must be done to both parties. Egica also asked the bishops to reconsider Canon 4 of the 13th Council, the canon that called for the protection of Erwig's family. But in this case, he was rebuffed. Nothing in the canon forbade the imposing of a just punishment on Erwig's family if they deserved one. If Erwig's sons were guilty of a crime, the canon could not save them from the penalties of the law. But the tone of the bishop's answer is tart and impatient, and shows something of the strong hand of Julian of Toledo. What the bishops did insist upon was that all judgments should be just, unquote. Thompson is entirely convinced that Egica was out to ruin Erwig's family. It is interesting that Erwig's wife was sent to live in a monastery only after Julian of Toledo died. Julian was a strong ally to Erwig, and if he had viewed this as a punishment, he probably wouldn't have allowed it. Still, I think that good arguments have been made in favor of other scenarios. It seems entirely possible that Erwig had usurped the throne from Wamba, used the kingship to acquire properties unjustly, and then took advantage of Canon 4 of the 13th Council to shield his family from any future reprisals. Egica, rather than seeking vengeance, perhaps was trying to address these crimes as honorably as he could, without any ill will toward his wife or his mother-in-law. The real interest of the 16th and 17th Councils is how they pertain to the Jews in Spain. Bernard Bachrach informs us that, quote, after putting down Sisebert's revolt, Egica called the 16th Council of Toledo, which opened on May 2, 693. Egica had all those who conspired against him condemned, and it was ruled that their property was to be confiscated and their descendants were to be barred from public office. Bishop Sisebert was deposed and defrocked. Egica also promulgated a new anti-Jewish policy that increased the penalties imposed upon those who dealt with Jews illegally. Important people, mayores, were liable for a fine of 216 solidi, and unimportant people, inferiores, were liable to receive up to 100 lashes with the whip and be fined at the king's will. All property held by Jews that had been obtained from Christians was to be confiscated by the crown, but compensation was to be paid. Jews were not permitted to carry on trade with Christians within the Visigothic kingdom, nor were they allowed to engage in long-distance commerce beyond its borders. In addition, Jews were subjected to very burdensome taxes, which they presumably could not pay, having lost their wealth. The bishops at the 16th Council confirmed this law, but specifically noted that they did so only at the king's behest, unquote. Two things immediately stand out here. The first is that the clergy didn't expressly approve the extent of Egica's anti-Jewish measures here. And the second is that despite Egica's hostility toward the Jews, he still required that they be compensated for their confiscated property. Even if, as it has been suggested, the compensation was not just, there is at least the pretense which strongly suggests Egica was not motivated by greed. Thompson informs us on what happened next. Quote, when the 17th Council met on November 9, 694, the first subject that Egica mentioned in his tome was the Jews. He had heard an alarming piece of news. It was reported that in some parts of the world, the Jews had rebelled against their Christian rulers, and that many of them had been killed by the kings. He had now learned from confessions that the Jews of Spain had conspired with Jews overseas to rise one and all against the race of Christians and to destroy the Christian religion. The confessions would make this clear to the bishops. The Jews had persevered in secret in their unbelief. Now, therefore, their wickedness must be ended, except for the Jews in Narbonensis, which was so ravaged by plague and Frankish raids that there were few inhabitants left there. The Jews of that province were simply to hand over their property to the dukes. In their 8th canon, the bishops followed up the news of this conspiracy. It was of course a figment or an invention of Egica's, with the last and most ruthless of all the laws relating to the Jews in Spain. Since the Jews had tried to bring ruin upon the fatherland and all the people, their cruel and astonishing presumption must be extirpated by an even crueler punishment. The bishops therefore decreed, on the order of our most pious and most religious prince Egeka, that the Jews should be stripped of all their property, and that they and their wives and children should be taken from their homes and enslaved forever throughout all the provinces of Spain. They would never be freed or given an opportunity to practice their religion. Some of their Christian slaves would be chosen by the king to take over their property, and these men would pay the taxes that the Jews had hitherto paid. The tax on Jews, as a French scholar put it, outlived the Jews themselves. The persons upon whom the king bestowed the enslaved Jews would have to sign an undertaking never to allow them to practice their rights. Finally, their children would be taken from them when they reached the age of 7 years and would be handed over to devout Christians to be brought up and, in due course, married off to Christians." Unquote. The French scholar to whom Edward Thompson refers here is Jean Juste, who was not only Jewish himself, but ironically closed the work cited with the following words, quote, "The Jews and Muslims of Africa united with the Jews of the Visigothic kingdom to destroy it. Their plots were discovered in time, however, and the Jews of the kingdom were all reduced to servitude. It would not be for long. The end of their persecution soon arrived with the Arabs, and once their rights were returned to them, the Jews of Spain were once again free to engage in commerce and other professions." Unquote. Juste not only believed that the Jews plotted against the Goths, but he was convinced that the Jews saw the Arabs as their liberators. I also can't help but infer from his tone that in his mind, his fellow Jews had a right to buy and sell Christian slaves, and that Jewish religious freedom wasn't being honored as long as they couldn't freely mutilate everyone's genitals. Again, when Egeka had heard of their plot in 694, the Jews still owned Christian slaves and were circumcising them contrary to over 100 years of secular and ecclesiastic law. I'm continually left dumbfounded by the willingness of people to overlook any Jewish crime. This is not to say that the Visigoths did no wrong, but that's not the point. Time and time again, the Jews had been given numerous ultimatums, exceptions, and exemptions. The hostility against them went up commensurately as they ignored all of these. As for the Jewish taxes surviving the Jews, this is true, and here is what Juste said, quote, "When because of their betrayal, Egeka reduced all the Jews to servitude, so as not to lose the benefit of these special taxes, he freed the Christian slaves from the baptized Jews, slaves who should have gone to the treasury, and charged them to continue to pay the Jewish tax. Something legally astonishing. This tax subsisted after the legal destruction of the Jews, after the annihilation of their civil personality, and now had to be paid by Christians, good Christians, Christians of origin. The Jewish tax survived the Jews." Unquote. The part "so as not to lose the benefit of these special taxes" I strongly suspect is conjecture on his part. Here's Amnon Linder's translation of the pertinent lines of the 17th Council. Quote, "We have resolved furthermore that certain of the Christian slaves of those Jews should be chosen according to the choice made by our prince, and that they should receive as their personal property, from their former masters' properties, whatever our oft-mentioned lord should elect to grant in a royal document or in a document of manumission, and whatever duty to the public funds those Jews are known to have paid till now, their aforementioned slaves elected by our prince shall be obliged to pay in full, without any excuse." Unquote. This is highly interesting, and at first glance seems to suggest that Egeka was motivated by greed. But recall that the punitive taxes on the Jews were a measure meant to incentivize either their conversion or departure. They were not meant as a sustainable income. Solomon Katz even comments himself that, quote, "Egeka augmented their taxes, although he had made it impossible for them to obtain money with which to pay." Unquote. Also recall that at the 16th Council, a year prior, Egeka had seen fit to compensate the Jews for their confiscated property. Why did he make such a gesture if greed was his principal motivation? The idea of freeing Christian slaves from Jewish ownership and then placing them in charge of their former masters' estates, and with paying their taxes, may have been intended as a way to impede the Jews from using their former Christian slaves, or any other person for that matter, as proxy managers of their former estates, which would have thereby allowed them to not only retain their Christian slaves, but also to evade punitive taxes meant to encourage their conversion or departure. While the canon does not say this explicitly, it also doesn't say that Egeka freed the Christian slaves and charged them to continue to pay the Jewish tax so that he might retain its benefit. However, it is clear that from the record, the Jews were continually able to evade the law via bribes and other measures. The councils repeatedly speak of this. Moreover, consider the following passage from the Talmud. Quote, "It is not the mouse that steals, but the hole that steals. In other words, a mouse cannot steal an item unless he has a hole in which to hide it." Unquote. In any event, the main point to be taken here is that Juste had no question in his mind that the Jewish plot against the Visigothic kingdom was real and not a figment of Egaca's imagination. Bernard Bachrach challenges Thompson and others somewhat directly on this point. Quote, "Certain scholars have defended the Jews' loyalty to the monarchy and have argued that Egaca's claim that the Jews sought foreign support to overthrow him was a figment or an invention. The Doctor's plot is a ready parallel for the present-minded historian, yet Egaca's policy was pursued in 7th century Spain, not in Hitler's Germany or Stalin's Russia, and we must evaluate the evidence in its own context, not in light of more modern events. Is there any reason to disbelieve Egaca's charges? Had not refugi sought foreign aid to help rebel causes throughout much of the 7th century? Had not Jews actively participated in military operations against Wamba? Were not Jews sufficiently disadvantaged as a result of Egaca's policies that they would benefit by opposing him actively? Egaca was, after all, an extremely unpopular monarch who was condemned shortly after his death by a Christian writer as a king who persecuted the Goths with bitter death. Against the positive evidence which asserts that the Jews sought foreign aid to overthrow the king, and the circumstantial evidence which provides additional support for the charges, we only have the time-worn prejudice that Jews are an unwarlike people. Jews do not fight, but weep, discuss, and at most, try to bribe their enemies. The uselessness of such stereotypes for the historian who is attempting to evaluate the evidence for a particular event at a particular time is manifest, and I therefore can find no reason to conclude that Jews did not scheme to overthrow Egaca. It would have been strange indeed if they had not opposed him at least as vigorously as they had opposed Wamba when he came to power as the legitimate successor of a king who had pursued an anti-Jewish policy." Unquote.